3 of our lovely business studies. I'm sorry that I can't see you today. Sadly, COVID has stopped us from once again meeting up, but that's okay. We will continue on with our classes online, just like we were doing at the end of term 2. First of all, I'd like to just say apologies for the noise in the background. I live right next to a main road, so you'll hear a truck and a bus passing occasionally. Don't read too much into it, and we deal with far worse when we're in the normal classroom anyway, so we should be absolutely fine. So at the moment, we just have a do now in front of us, okay, and we have 2 questions. Number 1, what is an influence when we're discussing something in business studies? And number 2, think of the best business name you can and justify why it is the best and why it will attract people. So as always, when we do these things, this should take you about maybe 3 minutes to do at most, okay? I'll be quiet for 10 seconds or so. You can pause the video, take your time, and then unpause it when you need to continue on. Okay, so let's continue. Now, I do apologise. There might be some other noise going in the background of my house. There's another teacher here as well, so we'll have to compete with each other for while we're recording. Okay, so what is an influence when we're discussing something in business studies? Well, effectively, when we're looking at an influence, we are looking at something that can impact the thing that we are looking at already. Okay, so it's something that can change or impact something else. Okay, now for number 2, think of the best business name you can and justify why it is the best and why it will attract people. So I hope you came up with some really good ones. Okay, mine of course was, my screen's not working for a second. Aha, here we go. Mine's of course Thrift Spectacular Wizarding Shop. Why did I choose that name? Because people will be so unbelieving that someone will call their shop something so stupid that they'll be forced to look. And I've actually seen a couple of businesses like that where they have the stupidest name possible to just cause people to come look at it and go, my goodness, what is that? So let's keep on going on. So today we are looking at legal influences, okay? And we're basically looking at how legal things and the law can actually influence us setting up our business and getting further along with it, and how it can influence our business when we're actually operating it, okay? So when we're looking at legal influences or requirements of business, because that's sometimes what we can call them, okay? These are our 3 big legal influences and requirements, and there's a whole bunch of little ones that tack on to those, okay? So when starting a business, it is vital for you to know that the government and community around requires certain conditions to be met. These are not just expectations. Failure to do so can result in fines and imprisonment, and they will influence what you can and cannot do with your business, okay? So that's really the difference between when we say expectations and legal. Legal, you have to do it. If you're not doing it, something bad's going to happen. The expectation sort of just people expect it, but nothing really happens if you don't do it. Okay, besides you maybe losing a bit of business. Okay. Now the 3 big ones that we discussed are the business name, zoning, and health. And then other regulations we'll go slightly onto a bit later. Okay. So let's start off. Okay, business name is relatively simple, as you might imagine. It's about business's name. Okay. Now, when a business is named, it must be registered with the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, or ASIC. Okay, now ASIC is a very important financial institution, or government institution, sorry. You must know ASIC. It's been brought up a couple of different times. If you don't know what it is, I would suggest that you look into it again. It is very important, and it comes up again quite a number of times in Year 12. This is the legal requirement under the Business Names Registration Act 2011. Okay, so keep in mind it's an act, which means it's law, meaning you have to do it. Because of course the government needs to identify your business from all the others. Okay, so of course your business needs a name because the government needs to be able to identify it for when you're paying tax and things like that. So when we're looking at how to name your business, there's a couple of things that you have to think about, okay? And we can divide those into yeses and nos. Now, there's a couple of other things besides just what we have here, but these are sort of the basics, okay? So if you're thinking about naming your business, okay, one of the yeses, you can name it after your first and last name. Even if it's taken, you can still use, but you'll still need an alternative name for government records. So if your name was Paul Smith, you can say, this is Paul Smith's tool shop or Paul Smith's business or blah, blah, blah. Okay. Even if there's another Paul Smith in the country and they're using that business as well, business name, you can still use it, but you'd have to have an alternative name in the records that government would be able to identify you from. Okay. You could not, however, use names that are undertaken by another business. So you couldn't say, my business is going to be Knight Windows if there is already a Knight Windows there. Doesn't work, okay? But yes, your business must have an Australian business number or an ABN to identify it. And your ABN is basically a series of numbers that identifies you to the government. So they do have your legal name and things like that, but then the ABN is just, they input these numbers and it automatically identifies your business, okay? Some of you might already have what's called a TFN or a tax file number if you're working, which is basically, this is how the government identifies what taxes you need to be paying. An ABN is pretty much the same thing for a business. If you don't know what your TFN is or you want to get what your TFN is, you can come see me later on, or you can see Mr. Johnson, who's your careers advisor. It's very recommended that you look into it and see what you can get from it. Okay, so things that you can't do in regards to naming your business. Well, you can't name it anything associated with a government institution. So you couldn't call it ASIO, for example, which is our version of the CIA, okay, or national security. You couldn't call it ANZAC, okay, or you can't name it with anything in regards to the royal family. Because Australia is a monarchy like the United Kingdom, there's a whole bunch of laws regarding what we can and cannot do in regards to the Queen and the royal family's image. You can't label it something that misleads customers as to what your business actually does. You cannot label your business, for example, as a charity if it's not. Okay? And the business cannot have any obscene names. And if you don't know what I mean by obscene, maybe you want to look it up, but I'm sure you get what I know. Okay, so the next one that we're looking at here is zoning. Okay, now zoning is the political process of dividing up regions and cities into zones. Now, these are special areas in which certain activities are limited. For example, an individual cannot run an industrial business, so something that might be in a factory, for example, in a residential or housing zone. The reasons for that, I think, should be pretty obvious to you. If you're going to run, like, for example, a coal station, things like that, you're going to need massive smokestacks that are going to come up out of your factory and your plant, and they're going to be producing heaps and heaps of pollution. And you don't want 1,000 houses right next to that constantly getting that pollution. So zoning helps divide up the city to make sure that everything is appropriate. Okay, now zoning is a good idea. However, it can have negative consequences as well. So let's have a little look at this video and see what we have.
Zoning is a way for communities to separate land by use or form. For example, an area could be dedicated to commercial or industrial use, or there could be a restriction on how many housing units can be built. Zoning shapes the places where we live, but it also shapes our lives. Local zoning regulations determine where we can find housing, schools, and parks, and who gets to use them. Policymakers initially created zoning codes to protect public health. For example, to stop residents from getting sick from living too close to factories. But from the start, zoning has separated more than just land uses. It has also separated people. In the early 20th century, many communities explicitly used zoning ordinances to racially segregate neighborhoods, effectively declaring that different skin colors were as incompatible as a family's home and a smokestack. By the late 20th century, civil rights legislation outlawed overt housing discrimination. But those explicit racial barriers were quickly replaced by subtler methods. Even today, exclusionary zoning policies that restrict lower cost or higher density housing limit racial and economic diversity and raise housing costs. By driving up housing costs, restrictive zoning can exclude people from equal access to public resources, like schools and parks, and leave lower income workers unable to afford housing close to available jobs. When regions are more economically and racially segregated, everyone loses. Local economies see slower growth, and residents of all races are less upwardly mobile. And finally, despite being created to protect public health, zoning often pushes multifamily buildings closer to highways in areas with higher concentrations of air pollutants. As a result, low-income people and people of color are more likely to live in places that could make them sick. It doesn't have to be this way. When done thoughtfully, zoning can connect people and places, not divide us. Communities across the United States are beginning to re-examine the role of zoning and change their restrictive zoning rules, opening neighborhoods to multifamily housing, walkable densities, and more. For more information and resources, and to find out what other communities are doing to improve their zoning policies, go to urban.org/zoning.
Okay, so that's a very, what I would say, American-centric version of zoning, but it's still pretty much the same. Okay, so when we're looking at zoning, we are talking about dividing up that city or area into those different sections and basically going, okay, this little area is going to be for industrial use, this area will be for residential use, and you know what, this little area down here, that will be commercial where we have shops and everything like that. And you'll notice that there are certain little areas set aside for commercial use because you don't want a shop appearing right in the middle of a residential area. Because I want you to think about it. Let's imagine that a Woolies suddenly appeared right next to your house. Now, Woolies can serve hundreds of people all at the same time, and if they didn't have that special zone where they had their own parking lot and everything like that, all of a sudden your entire street's taken up, there's heaps of rubbish everywhere because it's not properly planned for, and so forth. So zoning is quite important, okay? And it's going to determine where you can actually put your business, because you can't, in most cases, just start a business from the back of your house. You have to put it in a special area. So the next one that we're looking at is health regulations. And by the way, if that previous video you couldn't hear it, the PowerPoint has been uploaded to here. You can just click the link that's in the PowerPoint and you can watch it yourself. Okay. So next one, is health regulations. Now, when operating a business in Australia, you are governed by the Work Health and Safety Act 2011. Now, this is supported by the New South Wales specific Work Health and Safety Regulation 2011. Okay. So, well, what does all that mean? Well, these acts protect consumers from disease, food poisoning, and accidents on the work site. Failure to do so can result in significant times and jail time, especially if it resulted in the injury of someone. Okay, so when you have these health regulations, they are existing to protect other people. It's not existing to protect your business, it's existing to protect the people that work for it, that work with it, or basically just live around it as well. Anyone that can be impacted in it are all stakeholders, okay? So these specific acts, and I want you to learn these acts and regulations because sometimes they can turn up in little questions for your examinations, are going to determine what you can and cannot do and what you have to provide, okay? So businesses in different fields have different health requirements from each other. The needs of a steel factory could be quite different from a local cafe. What I want you to do, and I want you to take, let's say 4 minutes for this, and I'll stop talking for 10 seconds. You can just hit the pause button, okay? I want you to, in your books, list down the requirements that each might have. So you might do a little table. On the left-hand side, you might have the steel plant. On the right-hand side, you might have the cafe. What does each one require, do you think, for health regulations, okay? If you don't know what a steel factory is at all, okay, it's a place where steel is made, where metals are made, okay? There's a little picture on the side just to give you an idea of what you might see in there. So I'll stop talking for 10 seconds. You can pause it. I want you to take 4 minutes to do this task. Okay, so let's have a look-see and see what I wrote down. So when we're looking at a steel factory, okay, for health regulations, these are some of the things that might be required if you were even in that steel factory. You might not even be working in it, but if you've entered that site, you need it, okay? For example, you will need to have a hard hat. It has to be well on site. There's too much risk of things falling down on you, okay? Steel cap boots must be worn on site. If you're carrying something and you drop it, that's going straight on your toes. It can either flatten them or cut them straight off, okay? So you have to wear steel cap boots. And employees must be regularly versed in evacuation procedures in case of a spill, okay? Look at that picture there. That's pouring molten metal into that other drum, okay? Imagine if that suddenly spilt over and there's a fire going around the place. Well, people need to know exactly where to go, okay? It's a lot more dangerous than just entering into a school, for example, and you know that our school at least a couple of times a year has to do evacuation procedures. Imagine how often these guys are doing it, okay? Now let's compare that to the health regulations that might be required of a cafe. Well, obviously you'd have to keep all utensils clean, okay? Because if you're serving stuff with filthy utensils, you're going to get diseases and other sicknesses presenting. You would have to ensure that employees preparing food are wearing gloves. If they're not, you've got problems. If they're not wearing gloves, you have to at least make sure that they have a place where they can quite regularly wash their hands. And employees with long hair must wear a hairnet, okay? Unless you want to be picking out hair from your teeth going like that for the entirety of the meal, you'd want a hairnet, okay? Now, there would be a ton more of safety requirements and health regulations that would apply to both of these, okay? And we know now in the midst of this COVID pandemic that the health regulations have changed quite a bit now, okay? So, for example, a lot of businesses, just to even get into their property as a customer, the businesses are responsible for this as well, you have to be wearing a face mask, okay? If you don't, what's going to happen? Well, if a copper sees you, you can get a fine, okay? A really good example of this was due to the health regulations passed by the government a couple of weeks ago, where it required you to wear a face mask inside any building if you're going into it for public use. The Deputy Prime Minister, a man named Barnaby Joyce, actually got a $200 fine just for entering a 7-Eleven without his mask. So even a Deputy Prime Minister is not safe from these health regulations of businesses. So the next ones that we're looking at are these other regulations, okay? And these are the ones that sort of the leftovers, and they're important, but they're not as important as the other ones, okay? And we're going to be doing a bit more on those a bit later on, okay? So besides zoning, health regulations, and legal, there are a number of smaller legal influences that may or may not impact your business, okay? So obviously that wasn't meant to say legal there on the third one either, that was meant to say zoning, my apologies. So let's have a look at what these are, and we'll give a brief summary of them, okay? Now, licenses, as you might imagine, certain businesses are dangerous and you need to have a license to be able to operate in those industries. It's no different from if you want to drive a car, well, you're going to need a driver's license. Simple, okay? Well, if I want to operate a steel factory, I'm going to need a couple of licenses saying to people that I know exactly what I'm running, I know what's happening, and I need to pay and get the training for those licenses. If I operate my business without that license, bad things can happen. I can get a lot of people hurt, but the government's going to find me and basically fine me an excessive amount of money and quite probably put me in jail if someone got hurt. Okay. The next one is consumer laws. Now, these laws apply to every business, okay, regardless of distinction. And these are the laws basically saying, for example, that you can't falsely advertise to people, that your product needs to do what it says on the tin that it does, okay? There's a whole bunch of consumer laws, and we can have a look at them later on, but it's important that you realize that they are a legal influence and that consumer laws, as you might imagine, protect the consumer. Now, there's a lot of different legal influences in regards to mergers and takeovers. In case you have forgotten what those two are, a merger is when two businesses voluntarily join together, and a takeover is when one business takes over and basically incorporates the other business into itself. Okay? One's voluntary, the other's not. But there are a lot of different laws in regards to how those businesses can actually do that. Because as we were looking at last term, if you get one business that keeps on merging and taking over the other one and taking over the other one, eventually it's going to be the only business left in that field, and it's going to be a monopoly. And governments don't generally like monopolies, so they can sometimes stop businesses from doing mergers and takeovers, and there's all these different legal proceedings that you have to follow if you want to do it to make it as difficult as possible. So that's an important thing to remember. There are certain legal limits to how much you can price something. Most of the time, you're going to be influenced by price. As if you set it as $100 per bottle of milk, nobody's going to buy it. And that's how that most of the time influences it. But certain things in regards to medication and things like that, sometimes the government says, no, we are setting a limit to how much you can charge for this, because we know that people won't be able to afford it, and we know that if you set up your price, all the other businesses in the field will follow you, so we're going to set a maximum price. And the last one is patents, okay? And patents are basically when you have a new idea in the business world and you don't want somebody else copying your idea, you put a patent or a copyright on it, and it basically says that person cannot legally copy your idea or use your idea without your permission. And if they do use your idea, they're usually going to have to pay for the ability to use your idea. Okay? Now, what I want you to do is I want you to read pages 211 to 214 of your textbook, starting from the title Other Regulations to where it says Human Resources as the next title. Okay? After you've done that, I want you to complete the role of the Trade Practices Act of PDF worksheet. If you're working from home, either submit a digital copy or write down the answers in your book, take a photo and submit them. So what I mean by that is you can literally just write the answers on a Word doc and then submit them into Google Classroom. Or you can write down the answers in your book and then just take a photo and submit that photo off. Okay? I hope you have a good day. I will see you again next lesson. If you have any concerns, please email me. Thank you.